Professor Wergely's here. We're going to make our first Angular app. We just downloaded the Angular Tour of Heroes app right here. And you got to be careful because once you install the node modules, these projects get large. So even though we're writing 20 lines of code and we can make a complete application, you'll see that the size of this is 500 megabytes. It's just a little test app with default data, and it's almost a half of a gigabyte. So be careful. Even this little test app, this is just starter code. We didn't write any code. It just had starter code. You'll see this is going to be a large size too. It has the node modules. That's why you do not submit node modules when writing your applications. You'll submit this package JSON, which specifies the node modules that you need, and then we'll download them when we grade it. Now, you'll see even the default app with no lines of code. We didn't write anything. All we did was say, give me a new app. It's already almost half a gigabyte. The only reason this one's a little bit larger is because we had a few more files. But you'll see these projects can get large quickly. Now, that's mainly from the node modules. So if I go back over here and just look at the node modules directory, it was 500 megabytes. Look at this. Node modules is 400 of those megabytes. The other one is just basically text files with code in them. So that's an important thing to remember. You know, when I look at this live example application, you know, they're only writing a few lines of code here. Here's 26 lines of code, which makes a complete application. But underneath the hood, there's a lot happening here, especially if you use Angular material. Then you add a CSS framework or library as well. So what's cool about frameworks is you write 20 lines of code, you can make an app. But underneath the hood, there's a lot going on. So the apps become pretty large. Once you compile it, it'll be smaller. They'll compress the files. But that's the pros and cons of frameworks. You write less lines of code, but you make more powerful apps. And the reason you make more powerful apps is things are happening in the background. A bad thing is if the framework breaks, there's so much happening in the background, you don't really know how to fix it. But the good thing is you write 20 lines of code and you can make an app. So everybody's using frameworks now. Everybody's using Angular, React, Vue, and some other popular ones as well. So let's make our first app. We downloaded some code. Since these are large, I would keep the Tour of Heroes there, but I'm going to remove these other ones. So I'm going to remove the Angular Tour of Heroes. That one was just a default app. And you'll see it takes some time, even with a force remove. It's going to go through all those node modules. And I recommend you remove these with the terminal. If I go to Windows and I right click and select delete from the UI, it's going to take forever. It goes through all the node modules. It asks you permission. You got to click yes, 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 because you're not the owner. So I do recommend removing Angular apps with the terminal. But be careful if you do a force remove like I'm doing here. It's a recursive remove with a force. It will wipe it from the hard drive and you will not be able to recover it. Okay, so be careful with force removing. Make sure that's when you really want to delete. And just to save space, we could even delete this one if we're not going to run it. Okay, because that's already half a gigabyte. So if you install a bunch of these apps, you're going to take up quite a bit of space. So we're going to make a new one. So remember the Angular CLI. It's going to be ng new. And we're going to create a to-do list. So I'm going to create a to-do list. So you're going to name the application. And you can name it to-do app, to-do list, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it to-do app. Now this first app, I want to keep it simple, just focused on Angular. So for the routing, I'm going to click no. I'm just going to have one page on this app, and I'm going to use the SCSS. Remember, it's between CSS and SAS, so it's a good combination. Without creating a router file, we can simplify Angular. I recommend to go over an Angular app without having the router file Then once you understand Angular directives and the corresponding information, then you can start getting into the more complicated apps with having multi-pages. So multiple pages apps in Angular. It's not difficult. It has a routing file. It's basically an array. It loops through the array one by one until it finds a corresponding page. But if you're just new to Angular, it's a steep learning curve already. So you want to get familiar with Angular as simple as possible. So if I open this up, you always got to make the app and then make sure you CD into the app. And if I do an ls, you'll see it install the node modules and everything for me. So if I do an ng serve -- open, it'll go ahead and compile the current app and then open it up in the browser. Okay, you'll see this is the default app. And right now I only have one component. So what I like to do is set it up, install it, serve it, and then I'm going to open it up over here in VS Code. So if I click on open, go to the current directory, open up your to-do app, and then VS Code handles Angular apps very nicely. So you'll see I have node modules up here. I have the source file. You see I have the package JSON. The package JSON specifies all the dependencies. So we need Angular core, Angular compiler, Angular router, all of these dependencies. So whenever we download it, we do an npm install, and it's going to install all the dependencies for us. That way the app is small while you're transferring it between developers. Now take a look at this. I have an index file. This is a single page app. Remember the hashing and history lecture? I had a div called stage. Well, they have the template here. So you'll see the doc type, language equals English, character set. Check this out, title. They have the meta tag. This will pass the validator. And then everything that's clicked on or loaded will be replaced here in app root. Then if I open up app, you'll see I have one component to make it simple. And a component is basically one element. It could be a page, it could be a nav bar, it could be a button. It depends on what you want to create. With a component, you'll always have an HTML file, a CSS or SAS file, whatever you use, SCSS. You'll see this spec TypeScript file. This is one that you will not touch. This is auto-generated. Now the app component is corresponding to the component, but the app module has nothing to do with the component. This app module is kind of like your main controller file. So you can imagine this is like a sub-controller. This is your main controller. And the most thing that we do here is the imports. So let's say we're using Angular material, you'd add the import here. If you're using Firebase, you'd add the import here. So these 4 files you're going to see with every component. So when we get into multi-pages, every page will have a component, and every component will have these 4 files. You'll develop in the HTML file, you'll develop in the SCSS file, although we're going to be using CSS framework, so we won't write much code. And then the TypeScript file is like your controller. It's like your JavaScript file. And this is where all the functionality will be performed and written. So first, this is the demo page. You'll see it's a placeholder and can be replaced. So I'm going to take all of this and I'm basically going to remove it. When I run the app and come back over here, that's what you're going to see here. Okay, so I'm going to remove it because we're going to make our own. And we're going to start fresh. No CSS. TypeScript just has the title. That's fine. We got rid of all the HTML. Now, what's cool about Angular and other frameworks too is that we can basically write regular HTML. I can close this here. What's nice about VS Code is they actually have a terminal. So I can open up a new terminal. It's going to open up in the current directory. If I do a PWD, that's the current directory. If I do an ls, you'll see everything's here. I can actually do an ng serve here. And then I can create a new terminal And whenever I need to create a component, I can do it over here. So I like to have two terminals open here on VS Code. One is serving the app. The other is adding components or whatever else I need to do. Okay, so first I'm going to show you how to add Bootstrap just like you would with a regular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript file. I want to simplify Angular, and we're going to get this up and going. And then I'm going to show you the proper ways to implement this project. Remember, this is a single page application, so technically everything's going to be placed in the app root here. This is an index.html file. So even though we're writing all these components, once the page loads, this component is basically going to be placed right here. So let's say I wanted to add Bootstrap to this page. Although this isn't the proper way to do it, it's as simple as going to the current Bootstrap, which I believe we're on version 5, and pulling the CSS. So if I copy this, the CSS, if you wanted the JavaScript, you could as well, but I'm just going to put the CSS. It's as easy as putting the CSS right here, because everything for Angular gets compiled back to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Even though I'm using all this here, it's going to get compiled back to the languages of the web. And even though this is a single page app, it's got TypeScript. Once I build this out, it will go back to a regular single page app. And when the page loads, it's going to be placed here. So if I put my Bootstrap link here, any class that I have in any component, it will be applied to. So it's actually not recommended to change this index.html file. I'm doing this to simplify Angular so you understand how it works. Later, we're to come back and fix this up and actually use the Angular NPM package. So here I put Bootstrap imported here. So now let's say I go to my first component. It's just a simple component. We erased all the code. And now I can just go ahead and build a regular form. So remember, with Bootstrap, everything needs to be in a container. So I'll make a class called container. And since I'm using this Bootstrap class and I put it in the index file and everything is a single page app, so it's all going to be replaced here, this Bootstrap CSS library will be applied. So if I do class container, it will be there. And then let's say I just keep it simple here. I just create a form. And in this form, I have a div. I use another Bootstrap class, let's say form group. If you look up the Bootstrap components, when you have form elements, if you put them in a form group, they'll be formatted nicely. Then I have an H1. And let's say in the H1, I use some more Bootstrap classes. So let's say I want the text center. And I want the text as primary, which is like a blue color. Remember, Bootstrap is from Twitter. Twitter has a lot of blue. And then let's just say I have this as my to-do app. This is the H1 that the user will see. And then let's say I have another div, which is going to be an input group. And I could use the prepend. And then I just have a regular input element. If I want to collect this through the back end, there's a few ways I can do it. Right now, I'm going to use what's called template-driven forms. But for this class, I prefer you to use reactive forms. In order to learn about that, you'll want to go over here to the Angular docs and look up forms and go over this. Introduction, reactive forms, validate, form input. There's basically 4 articles to read here. This is going to be on the exam. You want to know the difference between template-driven forms and reactive forms. You'll see Angular provides 2 approaches to handling user input through forms, reactive and template-driven. Both capture user input events from the view, validate the user input, create a form model and data model to update and provide a way to track changes. I believe they give a basic overview right here. You'll see reactive forms provide direct, explicit access to the underlying form object model. Compared to template-driven forms, they are more robust, they're more scalable, reusable, and testable, which is why I want you to use them for this class. If forms are a key part of your application and you're already using reactive patterns, which is basically JavaScript objects, for building your application, use reactive forms. Template-driven forms rely on directives in a template to create and manipulate the underlying object model. They are useful for adding a simple form to an app, such as an email list sign-up form. They're straightforward to add to an app, but they don't scale as well as reactive forms. If you have a very basic form requirements and logic that can be managed solely in the template, template-driven forms could be a good fit. But you'll see even the Google Docs, template-driven forms were the first, and even the Google Docs kind of hint to try to use reactive forms. So that's a good programming practice. Template-driven forms are quick and easy to get up, but reactive forms are the better way to go. So we're going to take a look at template-driven forms. You want to know the differences. They actually have good diagrams here, good articles, good drawings, understanding how the data flows. You'll want to read this article. It's very important. You'll see a lot of those questions later on down the road. So first, I'm going to use a template-driven form. If I come back to the article here, you'll see it talks about choosing an approach. You'll see here's a reactive form. If I scroll down, here's a template form. So it's basically using ng model. We used to do this all the time, ng model, which is simple to set up. You'll see this variable needs to match the one in the TypeScript. And whenever they update this text input, it's going to update this variable dynamically. In the back end, if you update this variable, it'll also update the front end, which is why Angular is so powerful. It has two-way data binding. Data sent to the back end or the controller. And then if the controller is updated, it'll also update the front end in real time. So let's try this here. I have an input. I'm going to use a Bootstrap class here. Let's call it form control. And we can even do a placeholder, add to do. We can even give it a name. So when it's submitted, it's just called to do. And then we can do two-way data binding. So it's called ng model. Then you give it a variable name. Let's just call it to do. And then whenever it's connected to the back end, you'll connect to the to do variable. So if I scroll down, you'll see to do is not there. Let me take this out so you can just see the code. So I'm basically, so far, all I've written is HTML. There's no Angular here. Whenever I add that directive, now I'm starting to write Angular. Right now, this is all just regular HTML. So I come back to the page and view it. Check this out. So it's already looking nice. This is my to-do app with my input. It's Bootstrap. You'll see the Bootstrap is added. Now, by adding this directive here, this is called two-way data binding. It's called ng model. Remember, model is the data. So I'm connecting to the data, and we're going to just call it to do. Okay, we're going to call it to do. Now it's not going to compile. When I come over to the TypeScript, if I set to do here equal to an empty string, now it'll compile. It sees the variable in the back end, but we're using a form element. We're using ng model. Okay, so we may have to add some imports here. So if I come back to the page, you'll see failed to compile. If I open up the console, you can see logs here. This is all JavaScript, TypeScript. So you'll see here, errors while compiling, reload prevented. It doesn't really give you much information there, but it does give you information here in the terminal. You'll see type event is not assignable to a string. Sometimes I need to look these up myself. So you can literally, this is a TypeScript error. So you can search this here on Google and see what it says. Okay, we'll check out Stack Overflow. Looks like we need to import the forms module. A lot of times it's an import error. It doesn't know what that is. So if I come back over here, all imports are going to be in this main file here. For this component, we have 4 files. We have the HTML file, the SCSS file, this TypeScript file, which is pre-built and should not be modified. And then you'll have this component, which is basically your controller. It's going to be your JavaScript file, which we can modify. Then you have this app module. This is kind of your main controller, your main TypeScript file. And any imports you need to add will usually be here. So I'm going to do an import. Normally what I'll do for the imports is I'll do an empty brackets here, and then I'll do where it's from. Okay, so it's going to be from at Angular Forms. If I come back to this here, you'll see it's Angular Forms and it's called Forms Module. So if I leave the brackets empty, I can now type in F and you should see form modules here. If I don't have this here, let's say I left this off and I try to type it here, forms module did pop up, but normally you're not going to get it. Maybe it saw because I just recently typed it. Normally you're going to get a bunch of random stuff and it's not going to be the right one. Luckily we did find it here, and then you'll add it here to the imports forms module. So if you ever have an error, go ahead and look it up, see what you can find. Now I saved it. Now it compiled successfully. So if I come back over here, and we could do a console log. So basically, let's say down here, I could use interpolation and just put my to do. So watch how powerful this is. This is two-way data binding. So basically, when I type, it's going to update the variable here in the back end. And when this variable is updated in the back end, it's also going to display it here on the front end. And that's why Angular is awesome for their two-way data binding. No other framework has two-way data binding. React has one-way data binding, and there's a way to pass the data back to the front end, but it's not as easy as Angular. So check this out. As I type, look at that. It's updating to the back end variable and then updating to the front end. And that's what makes Angular so powerful. To my knowledge, no other framework can do this. You can do this with React, but there's some roundabout way to do it. It's not as simple as Angular. Okay, so that's two-way data binding. This is the easiest way to get up a form. We'll keep going. Okay, we'll keep going. So we have this input here, and we should probably have an add button. So let's say I do a span. I want to add this to, let's say, an array. I could use a Bootstrap class here called input group text. And then here's another. So everything's been just regular HTML so far. This is Angular code, and also this is Angular. And to do it on click, we're not going to use JavaScript anymore. We're going to use Angular. So do an on click, we make a directive, which is the click function. And then you specify what function you want to call. So I'm going to do add to do. And we have the ng model already. So I don't need to really pass anything, because as I'm typing, this to do variable in the backend is being updated. So whenever I click add to do, I can just grab that variable and add it to the array. So you see it doesn't compile, it's looking for add to do. This is why I like Angular, because it's TypeScript, so it's very strict. You know, if it doesn't see the function there, it's not going to compile. If the types don't match, it's not going to compile. And that's important because with JavaScript, it would compile. And then when you actually go to run the code, it crashes. And then you get some weird runtime error. With TypeScript, you can catch more errors at compile time, which is one reason people do like TypeScript. It's a little bit steeper of a learning curve, but once you get to know it, there are some positives for using TypeScript. So here, if I come down here and just add the method, add the function, I can do something as simple as this. I can create a to-do array. Okay, we're not even really using types yet. This is all basically just JavaScript. JavaScript, you do var. Notice I can't do var, but I could do let. I could do let, but we don't really need it because it's a global variable. So I just literally put the variable there. And then normally you do like a function and then you'd say add to do like this. But with Angular, we don't need the function keyword. So we just take this off. It knows it's a function because it has the parentheses here and a block of code. So what do I want to do when I add to do? So first, as long as the to do value, so as long as to do does not equal an empty string, then we're going to grab the to do array. If I just do to do array, you'll see it added to this keyword. Remember Java? This corresponds to the global variables, to the fields up at the top. You need to do that with TypeScript too. TypeScript will feel a lot like Java. So if I just do to do array and then call the regular JavaScript push method, it doesn't know which to do array you're talking about. But if I add the this keyword, since it's a field, it's a global variable, it sees it, and I need to add the this keyword here as well. Okay, it also doesn't know what this one is either. You'll see here, argument of type string is not assignable to parameter of type never. So we really didn't assign a type to this array, but we can. So we could say it's an array of strings, or it's an array of any. You could put any here. They have an any keyword. So I can say any type, or I can say I want to do an array of strings. So this is what's nice about using types. You see, if I just put any, it will work. Okay, it will work. It'll compile. You'll see it's a little bit harder to compile. If I take this off, we get an error. What does it say? To do implicitly has any type. If I take this off, we get an error. Argument of type any is not assignable to a parameter of type never. So it's a little bit harder to compile, but this is good. You want to define types. So technically to do is going to be a string, and we're going to set it to an empty string at first. And this to do array is going to be of a string array. So here we can say it's a string array, and now I can push this string to the string array, and I get no problem. So that's why TypeScript is a little bit harder to use, because you got to make sure you specify elements correctly. And then we can console log this. So once we push it, we can console log it to make sure we're actually pushing the right element. And then if it's empty, we can always display an error. So we can do an alert, and we can say to do field required. Okay, so we can do this here, save it. Now it compiles successfully. We have the add button. So if I come back, you'll see it's down here, which is okay. It's not the best. If I add it to do, let's say challenge 3, click on add, you'll see it updated it here, and then it should also update it to the array. So now we need to output the array. Instead of outputting one element, let's go ahead and output the entire array. So instead of outputting one element here, we can output the entire array. So after my form collection, I can have a class called data. We're going to add some of our own CSS. This is not a bootstrap class. And then we have an unordered list. Let's say with class list unstyled. This is a bootstrap class. And in here, we're going to use some more Angular for each list item. I'm going to do what's called an ng4. You can imagine this is like PHP, or even just a regular JavaScript for loop. I'm going to go for each to do in the to do array. In the to do array, I'm going to interpolate that value, just like we were doing before, but it's going to be the entire array. So you can imagine basically a for loop is created here, and it's a for loop or a for each of the to-dos in the to-do array, kind of like Python. And then there's a block of code here. And basically, we have a for loop around this li. And then let's say I got rid of this here, just be an li. And then I would do an echo to do, a PHP echo to do here. And that's essentially what the ng4 is doing. It's basically like a for loop on the outside, and we're printing out each element in that array. So if I say this, it compiles successfully. If I come back, it's not a persistent app. So every time I refresh, the data is gone. But if I do challenge 3, hit enter or hit add, you'll see that's in there. If I do challenge 3 quiz, hit add, you'll see it updates in real time. So check that out. It updates the array in real time and also outputs it on the page. So if I keep adding elements, you'll see I don't have to refresh the page. I add an element to the array. Once the array is updated, it also updates it on the front end, which is awesome. With, let's say JavaScript, I'd have to refresh the page. With Ajax, I wouldn't. You can kind of think of this like an Ajax request. When this data is updated on the front end, and then I click add, it updates this array. So I go back to the component, it updates this array. And whenever this array is updated, since I did an ng4, I don't have to refresh the page. It's like an Ajax request, and it updates this list item. Okay, which is why Angular is so powerful. And look how many lines of code I wrote. I wrote 16 lines of code with one function and one array, and I already have an app working. So I wrote what? 20 lines of code, 30 lines of code, and the app's already working, and it's not the best, but it looks decent. That is awesome, which is why Angular is so powerful. Then let's say I leave this blank, click add, I get my alert. Okay, so the code is working. Okay, now let's say we want to add some styles too. This is what's cool about Angular. If we use Material or Bootstrap, we can still use their pre-made classes. We haven't wrote any CSS yet, but if I want to write some, I can. So let's say here for the body, we do padding 0 and margin 0. So we're going to override the browser default. And for the form, we're going to do max width. So it's already too wide. Let's bring it down a little bit. Max width. Let's use a dynamic 25 EM. And if I do a little bit of margin, let's say 1 EM and then space auto, it'll be centered. So if I come back, you'll see it's a little bit smaller now, a little bit more reasonable. Add elements. I'm updating the array. It's updating in real time. And this is a basic Angular application. Real quick, before we end this lecture, let's go ahead and use Git. So if I do a Git status, it already made a repo here. You'll see it has a git ignore. It also has the .git file. So it's already made a repo. It's already done an initial commit. You'll see I have a git log. It did an initial commit, which had that default code. So if I do a git status, you'll see all the files that have been modified. So I did a git add all. Okay, so I'm adding all the files to the commit. Then I do another git status. You'll see they've all been added. And now I can go ahead and do a commit. So if I do a git status, I've added them all to the stage. If I do a git commit -a-m, we can keep track of what we've done. So we added Bootstrap to index file. We're going to fix that later because that's not the proper way. We added user input using template driven forms, which we should use reactive forms. I just wanted to keep things simple and clean. Then we stored to do item in the array, and we outputted array to display. Okay, so I'm gonna do a commit, do a git status, and we can keep track of all the versions of this code. We're gonna keep adding on. This is a basic Angular app. I wrote 20, 30 lines of code. I already have an app working. We're going to make this app look awesome. Stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.